Multiplayer is a bit of a weird beast in Paradox games. It's not a topic known for frankly even working particularly well sometimes, and is in itself very dependent on the underlying game as well. Furthermore, there is an important distinction to be made between competitive multiplayer, akin to a self-organized rank mode run by the community, and co-op with friends multiplayer, which is basically glorified single player, but you bring a friend or a few friends along to go achieve usually some co-op-y kind of goals together. Or even in the case of games that allow this, like EU4, literally co-oping the same country. I'll be covering both today, but I think it is important to mention as while they do share some underlying similarities and issues, like desyncs are an issue for both versions for example, well they tend to be quite different. But another thing I think is important to address is, why should Paradox care about multiplayer in the first place? I don't have any hard data on the subject, but I'll be honest, if as much as 10% of all Paradox players had at any point literally once ever clicked on the multiplayer button in any Paradox game, well, okay, on purpose, I have to clarify, more than 10% of people have ever clicked on the multiplayer button, but probably by accident. So let's change the statistic to 10% of Paradox players have played a single game of multiplayer. Anyway, back to the topic at hand, I'll be very impressed if more than 10% of all players have ever actually played a multiplayer lobby. And hence, this does beg the question, why should Paradox invest resources into it if they could instead focus on things that are, well, played by more people and enjoyed by more people? Well, my answer to that question is that if you extend this logic to its natural conclusion, Paradox as a company should just stop existing because map games as a whole are incredibly niche. Paradox at its core is a niche that was taken into the mainstream, one done so because it was well supported. And if that can be done for Excel spreadsheets with maps attached, I'm more than sure it can be done with multiplayer too. Multiplayer is not some forbidden concept after all that no game has ever pulled off successfully, and the multiplayer strategy game genre is one that includes many titans of old too. StarCraft is a household name after all. What I mean to say is with all of that though, is that while multiplayer in Paradox games may be niche, it certainly doesn't have to be. There's no inherent law of the universe dictating it as such. With that said though, before we get into the video proper, let's get the usual things out of the way. A like on the video would be appreciated, a subscription would be amazing. Finally, if you're interested in EU5 and are considering pre-ordering the game, or actually anything on the Paradox store, feel free to use code Lemon Cake for a 0% discount. Not the best modifier out there, I will confess, but it does support the channel. Anyway, enough self-shilling, let's jump straight into Crusader Kings. Although I lie, we are going to make one more detour for Imperator Rome, and while I would love to talk about multiplayer in Imperator Rome, unfortunately to have a discussion about multiplayer in a video game, you do kind of need multiple people playing it, which is a bit of a difficult task after Paradox basically ended development of the game in question. I think ironically the infrastructure in place for Imperator Rome multiplayer is fine, as in it is really similar to the EU4 system, a recurring theme for Imperator Rome, let's be clear, but I still believe an accurate statement. Anyway, I've spent more time talking and thinking about Imperator Rome right now than all the Paradox employees have done in the past month at least, so let's actually move on to Crusader Kings as promised. And as it were, when it comes to multiplayer, Crusader Kings 3 is in my opinion the perfect storm of failure when it comes to, well, multiplayer. I think it is important to say that I do like Crusader Kings 3, I enjoy the game, and while of course Crusader Kings 3 is not immune to Paradox innovations, let's get the basics established here. Crusader Kings 3 and even Crusader Kings 2 are by far the most roleplay intensive of the Paradox titles. This is fine, there's nothing inherently wrong about roleplay games, but unfortunately this focus doesn't lend itself too well inherently for a competitive multiplayer setting. But this is only the start of CK3's problems. Due to the nature of the game being about playing a person or a grander sense a dynasty, you're surprisingly vulnerable to what can be just straight up described as random bullshit, which is extra crippling in a multiplayer environment. In many ways, in Crusader Kings, there are events that have like a 5% chance or whatever to just straight up kill you. This is fine in single player, one could argue it's not the best game design choice, but I actually consider it quite faithful to reality. People did just go on a boat, the boat goes into some bad weather, and now they're dead. Like, this is an accurate thing for a Middle Ages simulator, but nevertheless, in EU4 or Hearts of Iron 4, either your characters like Hoi generals are effectively immortal, or their loss is significantly less devastating like EU4 generals. Furthermore, losing a 666 ruler in EU4MP and getting them replaced by a random 001 ruler sucks, but your country doesn't literally get deleted, and given how much diplomacy hinges on the individual and how much more focus there is on succession in Crusader Kings, look, these mechanics at their core make Crusader Kings 3 a better game, but they're not good for reliable, consistent planning in multiplayer. It is good that in CK3 you have to worry about your succession, and you have to have this worry in an environment where you can just accept that you can die at any point. So you have to kind of plan for the worst even in the best case environments. But getting an unlucky event that gives you a 5% death chance that then ruins your entire MP build for a war you were planning or something, well, that just isn't, shall we say, the best cases of competitive multiplayer gameplay. A feature that is good in single player doesn't automatically translate well for multiplayer, but then somehow it just actually keeps getting worse for Crusader Kings 3. See, one of the big changes from Crusader Kings 2 was your character actually had a location that you existed in, which was good for resolving absurdities from Crusader Kings 2, where for example your character could take a long pilgrimage to Jerusalem and spend 3 months traveling to Jerusalem, and then talk about how exotic the land in Jerusalem is and how other people talk weird, which sounds great, but my capital is Jerusalem. Not to worry, of course, in my headcanon, my ruler simply took 3 months to leave his palace room, but you kind of get the point. Anyway, another consequence that was enabled and elaborated upon rulers having an actual on-map location was now events such as feasts, hunts, weddings, university visits, funerals, stuff like that. They could all now happen, and those were more elaborated and more fun. I think activities as a whole are a big part of the enjoyment of Crusader Kings 3. And they're really whacking in multiplayer. First of all, usually if you're invited to such an activity, you basically have to pause to be able to accept in time, as since you need to travel to the activity, you need to, pretty much accept the invitation instantly. Secondly, since a lot of activities like tournaments involve elaborate cutscenes, and I find it designed with the assumption that the game was paused while a certain action screen is happening, well, they can quite literally break in quite an unfun way in multiplayer, simply because the content was not designed to be engaged with where the game wasn't paused. Given how central these activities are to Crusader Kings 3 as a game, them being broken does hurt the experience substantially. To add insult to injury, Crusader Kings 3 multiplayer in the year of our Lord 2025 is still somehow missing the ability to have an in-game chat, which I know the argument can be use Discord or use Steam chat, but if I'm sitting in a hypothetical 25-player lobby, for example in EU4, and I need to message the King of Austria to inform him that his intelligence is on par with a mildly concussed melon, well, I need to find their in-game name inside Crusader Kings 3, Shift-Tab or look at a different monitor, locate them inside of a Discord if possible, and send a message there, adding like 3 extra unnecessary steps. Discord messages can also be easily missed. Second monitors for Discord to play a game should almost certainly not be a requirement, and it does make it significantly easier to basically talk to the whole lobby quickly if I'm playing a game with in-game chat technology. A lost art since apparently Hearts of Iron 4 and Europa Universalis 4. What's extra ironic I find about all of this too is that of all Paradox games, with Crusader Kings 3 being the most narrative roleplay heavy of all of them, the ability to send someone a custom letter for communications would be kind of cool, I have to confess. That's not to say you can't have this feature in other games, but in an environment like Crusader Kings 3, this in my option would make the most sense. Now, is this something absolutely critical? Frankly, is it even that important? No, but this doesn't help multiplayer Crusader Kings 3. Furthermore, Crusader Kings 3 co-op multiplayer is also in a bit of a weird state where you can still have random things like a bad death or bad RNG events ruin your co-op plans, meaning you now need to account for, dare I say, even more possible bad luck, but also in an environment where a bunch of things that would be quite fun, like going on a hunting trip together, well, that's going to be more broken since activities and no multiplayer auto pause does diminish that experience as well, if you can manage to accept the invitation in time. To add more issues to the pile, dare I say, compared to other games like EU4 or Hearts of Iron 4, the co-op let's do a campaign together to help you learn the game. If you mess up, I'm there to cover for you, which is a non-trivial amount of co-op campaigns, I feel. Well, that's going to see significant less use in Crusader Kings 3 as well, since the game is frankly just easier, meaning there just happens to be less of a natural need for that. It's a bit of a weird combination of features and game design decisions that in total do mean that Crusader Kings 3 co-op multiplayer is lackluster compared to single player, with activities as the main example of something being finicky at best or broken at downright worst. And for the competitive scene, well, Crusader Kings 3 MP environment is just inherent game design is the flaw. I think there are certain things that Paradox can do to help this, like dare I say rework activities to function better in multiplayer, as well as frequent, if you look into the game code, AI only or player only event options. Well, those are somewhat soft proof that is not a fully neglected system, but it's certainly something that's going to need a lot more love. I believe it will be better to focus fundamentally on a more co-op type of multiplayer things first, but either way, that's the state of Crusader Kings 3, and with that said, let's move to EU4. EU4 multiplayer has some issues. Desyncs are a non-trivial one. The scope of the game means that you would ideally, for a full campaign, have multiple 4-hour sessions. I would say between 4 and 6 sessions to count as a full campaign, and in practice you're demanding 16 to 24-hour time commitments from the players, excluding out-of-lobby diplomacy time, although this tends to be stretched across literal months, as usually lobbies are rehosted weekly. Ironically though, while EU4 does have plenty of issues, like the hot join button actually being the desync button, and also hosting a lobby for too long causing desyncs and lobby ghosting, and look, I can keep going, but you get the point. Quite a few other things actually align quite well for EU4's multiplayer compared to Crusader Kings. Firstly, the move to more Spirit of a Nation kind of gameplay did eliminate a lot of your king slipped on a banana, your campaign is now over issues, and while succession still matters, it is significantly less important as every nation is running primogeniture now for all practical purposes. EU4 also has an extensive war system, which can be best explored in multiplayer and hence provides a huge depth of gameplay on top of that. It's not the most straightforward system for sure, let's be clear, but I think it's a more fun system. Another weirdly perfect storm for EU4 is that co-op campaigns for learning EU4, even just basically playing single player with some friends, tend to be a lot nicer. It both self-enforces a practical no-birding rule, but also gives you usually a locked ally, if not more, to help you if things go south. Another place that ironically EU4 does very well is modability. EU4 at its core is very unbalanced, and it's not like a Simple tweak of a few extra provinces here and there can help fix the inherent balance issues. What does help though is having the base game itself support a lot of modding options, enabling everything from Ambernar to extensive multiplayer mods which aim to at least rebalance it. These mods themselves are rarely a perfect fit, although some veterans of EU4 MP may recall Gecko version 4 as the peak balanced experience, while the reality of the situation is that by providing these extensive modding tools, EU4 multiplayer was allowed to at least self-balance to whatever extent its users wishes to or could agree on. Now this is something that Paradox games as a whole tend to be quite good at, but it's still worth mentioning here. Finally, while it is true that these things can be an issue, certainly unlike Crusader Kings 3 where activities kinda don't work half the time, well in EU4 all features, unless I'm missing something, work in multiplayer, same as single player, unless you count space to pause, which is very clearly a design decision to be removed. Now, I believe part of the problem that can be attributed to the lack of EU4's multiplayer, or at least the decreased size of it, is the time commitment demands. It is possible to play a campaign of EU4 leisurely throughout a whole real-life year, but a multiplayer lobby does demand a weekly 4-hour commitment usually, and this is more so a product of the game itself and hence can be attributed to the nature of the game design and less of a bad decision. Another issue, if it can be called that, is the decentralized approach of Paradox to multiplayer. This isn't inherently bad. Letting people basically go do their own thing and self-organize is in many ways a good thing, but it does mean that it tends to be, shall we say, a lack of support and even frequently a lack of communication between MP bubbles. Certain players will play only in the lobbies they know and get used to, but at the same time it becomes harder and harder for new lobbies to establish, as they need to basically almost poach players from each other, and it makes it harder for new people to get involved too, as the veterans of the community tend to be under no obligation to teach newer players. Again, there are advantages to this go have fun now approach, but there are certainly disadvantages too. Either way, EU4 I believe is one of the better games when it comes to a co-op-y multiplayer setting, as the base game itself tends to be a bit harder I'd say than Crusader Kings 3, hence giving more reason for a co-op play against the AI. And when it comes to the competitive scene, a more in-depth economy and war system, then again something like Crusader Kings 3 means that the competitive scene itself has something to well compete about. That said, it's not like EU4 itself is getting any updates anymore. EU5 is basically right around the corner. Does it do any better? Well, for EU5 itself, it's frankly quite hard to tell. I haven't been in a large lobby yet, so it's hard to test things like these things. Paradox does seem to care about EU5 MP though, with a whole dedicated dev diary to the issue, sorry, Tinto talk, and loads of extra host options which I didn't even consider as a possibility, but like, yes, I want this. I've had the opportunity to test features such as hot joins and even did some minimal testing of actually running an MP lobby, and I can confirm that what I've tested so far works like a charm. Hello, post-production Lemon Cake here. This is just a quick intermission to say that since the time of initially writing the script and recording this video, there has been another patch for EU5 which introduced a bunch of desync bugs into multiplayer. Because they were introduced, I'm assuming they will also be removed in time, but they could also just not be, so make of that what you will. Anyway, back to the video. And furthermore, in my understanding, Paradox is not about to start organizing any official beginners to EU5 MP leagues or a formal MP ranked mode or anything of that nature. Is still going to remain largely decentralized, if not entirely decentralized, for better or for worse. I can't comment on modding capabilities in EU5, I haven't tried them personally, but I choose to remain optimistic as modding support is something that Paradox certainly would want outside of just appealing to MP players, and hence I do remain, again, largely optimistic. But that said, it is hard to talk about multiplayer for a game that's not in a public state of release. Another game though, that is released, but should be at least briefly mentioned for multiplayer though, is Victoria 3. One of Paradox's more innovative titles. Here I do believe that the combat system of Victoria 3 is its fundamental detriment from a multiplayer perspective, but let's also be clear, I think it's not exactly helping Victoria 3 single player as a whole too. And while I understand the idea behind it to greatly reduce micro from warfare, all that it really does achieve at the moment with the current Victoria 3 system is a, let's be honest, bad war system that's frustrating and one that still somehow manages to demand a lot of micromanagement from the player anyway. Now, warfare in Victoria 3 is certainly a topic for its own video, let's be clear, and it's not as simple as a Victoria 3 war system bad. Again, peak innovations like the removal of the in-game chat box I would say are certainly not enough to destroy Victoria 3 MP, but they're not helping Victoria 3 MP either. It's hard to comment, and look, Victoria 3 MP certainly does exist in some capacity. I mean, I'm sure there are certainly co-op games of Victoria 3 MP that function fine too, but in this case specifically, fix war, and then we can talk. And on that note, let's end on a positive. Well, for the most part, the one game where I'd actually say, yeah, you know what, you didn't get war right, you kinda have to, but you certainly got war right, Hearts of Iron 4. If there was a video game from Paradox that has a good competitive and even co-op environment, then that has to be Hearts of Iron 4, aka the esports alta of Paradox titles. Now firstly, as opposed to Crusader Kings 3, where fundamental game decisions conspired against multiplayer, Hearts of Iron 4 actually has the opposite. The game is built around World War II, meaning you have a clear before the big war starts phase and a the war has now started phase, and that's it. A full game of Hoi4 may take multiple hours, even 6-hour sessions are in play here, but it can be played in one session, giving it a huge advantage of scheduling, as well as reducing the total time commitment required from its players by a huge margin. Furthermore, since the game at its core is about fighting one big war, World War II, one of Hearts of Iron 4's weaker elements, their peace deal system and diplomatic systems, are just not really in play here. When the peace screen shows up, that's just the win, and unlike EU4, with diplomacy involving backstabs, back and forth, and being a dynamic system, teams are kind of locked in place from day one. The war system is great, there's loads of things going for skill expression, both in national build-ups to war and the divisions built themselves. The navy system may be a complete mess to the vast majority of players, but if you are a rare navy enjoyer, it is in Hoi4 MP that you will meet someone else who's also a rare navy enjoyer and actually cares about it. Modding is also very supported, as one may guess for a Paradox title, meaning again balance is something the community can squabble over. Now, Hoi4 games are certainly not immune to the desires of the engine to extort rehosts and resyncs. It's not perfect, but look, it's serviceable, and the decreased duration per campaign actually means that even if desyncs per hour remain the same, desyncs per campaign are actually drastically lower just due to the shorter game time. What is also interesting, and I don't see this discussed much, but the actual skill expression in warfare tends to be more micro-intensive, setting up complicated plans, doing encirclements with tanks, clicking and attacking at the correct time, so on and so forth, making Hoi4 MP at higher skill levels, dare I say, more RPM dependent, as games like StarCraft, which I alluded to earlier, died, and its promised successor Stormgate, for example, released in a state that made Victoria 3 look like Game of the Year material. Well, ironically, Hoi4 Combat kind of absorbed, I feel, some of the RTS audience of titles such as, well, StarCraft again, or the Command & Conquer trilogy. Now, the RTS genre itself I don't wish to proclaim dead, or even absorbed into Paradox. Age of Empires 2 is certainly a game that continues to see play, attention and support, but I still think Hoi4 Combat does to some extent scratch the same itches. Hoi4 really is, though, in many ways the opposite of Crusader Kings 3, it is the perfect storm, well, almost. Of course, things like lobby stability can be improved, and changes like the little banner thing in MP where you can see some achievements and badges, those are all cool, but given the decentralized nature of MP, well, Hoi4 players have, let's just say, not earned the best reputation. As an example of what I mean, and I'm not going to mention names, but I've had a conversation with a Hearts of Iron 4 content creator, dare I say, and I was informed that when they tried Hoi4 multiplayer, they managed to receive a death threat for not having the correct amount of factories assigned to plane production. My immediate reaction to that statement was, what? That's insane, followed by, well, Hoi4 players, followed by, wait, that's really bad. Of course Hoi players have this reputation. That's a really bad reputation to have. Now, I'm sure good Hoi4 lobbies exist, and it's not like EU4 players have the best reputation either. Certainly I would say this as an EU4 MP enjoyer myself, but whether this reputation is earned or fabricated, let's be clear, is a separate debate, but this reputation exists. And from Paradox's perspective, this is one of the problems with a decentralized approach to multiplayer, one that is very hard to fix. Community management in that regard isn't an easy ask, even in a more centralized multiplayer environment, but I do still think it's still unfortunately a topic that has to be mentioned, as it's not an issue that can be ignored in good faith. Mechanically though, Hoi4 is great for MP. But with that said, to summarize, Crusader Kings 3 bad, but the multiplayer state was almost rigged against them. EU4 has issues but fundamentally does well. Victorious 3 innovated one too many times, while Hoi4 is probably the closest to actual esports Paradox can hope for. That being said, that is all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. The special thank you to Ark, Soda, Lemon, Lozendica, Nikas, Nanhatan, Sal72, The Awesome Rabbit, Best for Gaming, Graham Flavia, Lebarule, W Haste, Sov, Anthony35, AC Napo, Conspiracy Pizza, Yukata, Dunray, Malvi, Jack, Ryland, Stuart Allen, Andrew Black, Nebula, Zentronic, and Twynet.